It seems like a lot of you guys found the video on which RTX 3080 to buy pretty useful. So this time I'm going to be analyzing which RTX 3090 to buy. And I'm going to step it up a notch with some actual cooling performance data that I gathered from the reviews, as I unfortunately still don't have my own card to test. Of course, I won't just blatantly show another reviewer's data, but I'll be compiling a lot of reviewers' data to make my own useful data, as you'll see later. In this video, I'll be comparing the models that I can find reviews of, which are the Nvidia Founders Edition, Asus Strix, Asus TUF Gaming, MSI Gaming X Trio, Gigabyte Gaming, Gigabyte Eagle, Palit Gaming Pro, and the Zotac Trinity. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be any EVGA reviews yet again, even though I'm sure a lot of you guys are interested in the EVGA cards as well. The first chart here is a VRM power design, which I gathered by looking at the PCB shots and looking up the model numbers online, which admittedly some were done by Tech PowerUp on the ones they reviewed, but I think their Zotac one was a mistake saying it's 13 phase when it's actually 14 phase, and the MSI is using a weaker power stage than the ones they were mentioning in the review. Well, as you can see here, the Nvidia Founders Edition tops the chart with its apparently 16 phases of 70 amp monolithic power systems DRMOS setup, which is pretty ridiculous to see all the other GPUs being outclassed in this regard. As you can see, even the Asus Strix is still below at 1080 amps of max current rating using 18 phases of 60 amp Texas Instruments DRMOS, followed by their TUF Gaming with still an impressive 880 amps of max current rating using 16 Vishay 55 amp DRMOS, then Gigabyte with 750 amps of max current rating using 15 Alpha and Omega 50 amp DRMOS. The Zotac and Palit are equal with 700 amps of max current rating using 14 50 amp Alpha and Omega DRMOS. Then there's the MSI Gaming X. I really had to question myself if I am missing something here, but it does seem like apparently MSI has the weakest RTX 3090 VRM here at almost half of the Founders. And the kicker here is that the RTX 3080 Gaming X is actually more powerful for some reason. So the RTX 3080 Gaming X is using 13 phases of 50 amp power stages, which total 650 amps, but this 3090 is using 14 phases of 45 amp power stages, which total 630 amps, so it is quite confusing to me. Why are they doing this? So I'll get to this later in the video, but it's really also quite a surprise to me to not see even one manufacturer surpassing Nvidia's Founders Edition VRM here, which is not what you typically see in the previous generations of GPUs. And no matter how powerful a VRM is, it is still limited by the power limits, which on these cards I gathered the data by looking at the BIOS, if it's available, or comparing it to the Founders Edition's power consumption in reviews. The max power limit can be calculated by knowing the maximum power limit percentage when overclocking as well. Here you can see the Asus Strix is on top, and it's clear now why they have gone with that VRM design, as they're allowing the Strix to consume up to 390 watts stock, and allowing up to an insane 480 watt with the sliders max to the right. This I really like. I think cards like these are an overclocker's dream, as new cards are so limited by their power limit, so this might actually be able to really outdo the other cards by a big margin when overclocked, as the other cards are just way more limited in power. It also justifies this card's triple 8-pin power input setup for sure. Interestingly, the next card down is the Founders Edition, despite it having the strongest VRM among all the cards. So it just feels like a wasted opportunity here where Nvidia could have increased the max power limit they allow, but they do still have only dual 8-pin power input, so I guess that's not really an option. The next two cards are the Gigabyte and MSI with the same 385 power limit, but it seems like MSI also raised their stock power limit to 370 watts, which is a great thing to see, especially for anyone not looking to overclock themselves, as it's above the rest and only slightly behind the Strix. So I was quite disappointed after seeing the TUF Gaming's awesome VRM design that they only allowed up to 375 watts, which is the same as their RTX 3080 TUF Gaming, but that makes sense since they're using basically the same PCB and cooler, and the dual 8-pin can only really support up to 375 watts if they're to remain in spec anyways. Next is the Palit Gaming Pro, which is a little bit underwhelming at 365 watts to say the least, but considering their subpar cooler, which I'll show later, it's not really a surprise. At least it's still better than Zotac, coming in dead last yet again, just like their RTX 3080 at just 350 watts, not allowing any increase to the power limit. Really, it just seems to me like they're not that confident at all in their own designs by limiting the power limit so low like that. Now for the controversial capacitor design choices. These are what the cards have. Take a look and take it however you want, since it seems like Nvidia already fixed the crashing issue with the new driver update anyways. Like I explained in a video about what exactly caused the crashes and what Nvidia did to fix it. So if you want to check it out, you can check out the link on the card up top or on the description. A lot of people also commented on my RTX 3080 video on how Gigabyte is using higher quality SP caps, and they had really no problems with their cards. But I also saw their buyer took the Gigabyte card and replaced the SP caps with MLCCs and gained about 20 to 30 MHz extra when overclocking. So it still seems like MLCCs are somewhat better than SP caps for stability. Now for the most interesting data, which is the cooling efficiency calculations I did based on the reviews data. Yeah, for sure, I am aware of the flaws in using different reviewers' data, since obviously not all reviewers are using the same methodology or testing environment, so this is not really the best use case of their data by compiling it together like this. But the cards will all hit the max power limits these days, and so it'll have a mostly consistent heat output. So for our purposes of calculating which models have better or worse cooling efficiency, it is quite accurate enough. Basically what I did is combine the data from TechPowerUp, Guru 3D, and Hexus.net, because their data for the same cards that they all tested are quite similar. What I mean by this is that, for example, when they reviewed the RTX 3080 Founders Edition, the temperature and noise results by the three sites were within a few units of each other. So it's close enough to be used for comparisons just to see which cards are better or worse, since a difference of 50% within the measurements aren't really gonna change the positions of the cards. I just use the worst results for each card if they test the same cards as well. Even so, I do still suggest looking at the review source yourself and judging by yourself. I calculated the relative cooling efficiency by calculating the relative temperature and noise level first, by dividing the average temperature with the individual temperatures to get the relative temperature, and then dividing the noise level by the average noise level to get the relative noise level. Then I divide the relative temperature by the relative noise level and subtract that by 1 and multiply the result by 100 to get a percentage. This basically tells us the cooling to noise ratio in relation to each other, which is the relative cooling efficiency. So here's the graph, where 0% is the average. Keep in mind the cards operate at different power limits too. So to directly compare only the cooler's efficiency, you can only compare cards with the same wattage, as it affects this value quite greatly. MSI seemed to have the most efficient cooler this time, which is quite perplexing to me, as when I checked for the MSI RTX 3080 Gaming X Trio in multiple sites, I found it's usually slightly behind the RTX 3080 Tough Gaming in efficiency. So somehow with a higher heat load with the RTX 3090, it's more efficient than the Asus RTX 3090 Tough Gaming, although it's still also not a very big difference. Asus has also shown great results with the Strix card though, which basically matches the MSI card that uses 20 watts less power with both in the quiet BIOS. The performance BIOS, however, the Asus cards get really loud, and so the cooling efficiency takes a big hit. Still, with the Asus card matching the MSI card that has a lower power limit, it's easily above it in cooling efficiency. The Gigabyte Eagle seems to be a lot more efficient than its gaming version, probably thanks to a lower factory overclock and not chasing the lower temperatures. But it might just be some error in the measurements of the data really. The Founders Edition card actually also manages to beat Asus Tough Gaming in the quiet BIOS, which was not much quieter than the performance BIOS. It's also impressive as it's also the only dual fan card when everyone else had triple fans. Next, I think the Zotac card is still acceptable from the cooling and noise performance, but I really still don't see any reason why anyone would pick this out of literally any card, except maybe the Palit Gaming Pro, which is the worst card here. I mean, what the hell went wrong here, Palit? It has the loudest and hottest running cooler, due to being the smallest size one out of everything else in comparison. To be fair, it doesn't thermal throttle, but it's still unacceptable when you're buying a graphics card this expensive. I don't know who decided this was a great idea, but Palit basically copy-pasted the cooler from the RTX 3080 design, which was already barely adequate there. The Gigabyte, MSI, and Zotac cards also did the same thing, but the difference is that their coolers were overpowered for the RTX 3080, so it worked fine with the RTX 3090 as well. I think a lot of people would prefer I do the rankings on how the cards stack up first, before I go into more detail onto each one. So for number 1, I would definitely pick the Asus Strix if you want the best RTX 3090 there is. It absolutely does not compromise anywhere. Using the biggest cooler and the best VRM and PC design out of the rest, this card is clearly in a different tier to the others though, so the price might also be in a different league as well, which would be its biggest downside. Second and third place are tough choices between the MSI and the Asus TUF, but I think second place should go to the MSI Gaming X Trio for the average user, since it has an increased power limit out of the box and a great performing cooler ideal for anyone not really looking to manually overclock. But the VRM components are the worst out of all, so this is not one for the overclockers and also for those who actually care about their GPU's PCB design, like me for example, because it just feels like you're getting a really cost cut down PCB when you're getting a PCB that's almost half as powerful as the Founders Edition. A very close third place then would go to the Asus TUF Gaming, which would really take second place for the overclockers and enthusiasts, thanks to its second best VRM and PCB design and a cool running cooler. It's a great card for anyone looking to modify and tinker with it, but for the average user, the MSI card will perform better out of the box. Fourth place would go to the Gigabyte Eagle, as it has a better cooler than the Founders Edition, and a better VRM and PCB design than the MSI card. Unfortunately, the stock power limit is also only 350 watts, so the higher powered MSI card will beat it in performance while being cooler and quieter, and the Asus TUF Gaming has a much better PCB design and a better cooler as well. So the Gigabyte card then is okay, but it really does not have anything special about it, which is why I place it at fourth. The Founders Edition then would have to take the fifth place, as it has the best PCB design, better than the MSI and Gigabyte, and a high 400 watt maximum power limit, which is just behind the Asus Strix. But the cooler is bested by MSI and Gigabyte, it would seem. For sixth place, I would put the Gigabyte Gaming there, but since it really should be very similar to the Eagle card, it really should have scored better if they had tuned the fan curve better. Or the reviewers just messed up their measurements and you should disregard this and maybe just consider the Gigabyte Gaming the same as the Eagle card, as, like I said, the design are pretty similar with the same PCB and cooler design. Zotac then moves up to the 7th place instead of being dead last like their RTX 3080, since their card actually has an advantage over Palit's, which is their cooler, which seems to handle the RTX 3090 better than Palit's Gaming Pro does. They also didn't cheap out on the PCB too much by removing polymer caps from the VRM area this time, but they still used the cheaper SP caps behind the GPU than Gigabyte SP caps. The Palit Gaming Pro at 8th place then, even though it has a higher maximum power limit than the Zotac and a somewhat better PCB design by using MLCC on the back of the GPU, I can't really recommend it for its temperatures and noise levels, which are a lot worse than the rest of the cards, and it's really quite unacceptable for a GPU this expensive. I mean, they shouldn't really have put their RTX 3080 cooler on this one, especially as it's quite a small cooler. Okay, so now let's take a look at the cards one by one in descending order. The Asus Strix here by far has the largest heatsink out of all the cards, and it's a necessity too, considering it has the highest stock power limit at 390 watts and an incredibly high maximum power limit at 480 watts too, really putting its triple 8-pin power inputs to good use, but really only barely using up its VRM, which has a 1080 watt maximum current rating that uses 18 phases of 60 amp Texas Instruments NextFET CSD95481 RWJ DRMOS components controlled by the Monolithic Power Systems MP2888A digital controller. Not to mention, they also went all out with putting MLCC on the backside of the GPU, which should help stability. Aside from the way overkill VRM, Asus also seems to be putting voltage checkpoints on the PCB backside, so it's as if they're really begging for extreme overclockers to mod this card. This is a very performance-oriented card, and you can also see that in how they set a pretty aggressive fan curve to keep the temps down. The next card is the MSI Gaming X Trio. It's also a massive triple fan design for the cooler, so it does cool pretty well. Although I still question MSI's use of direct contact heat pipes on the cooler, as GPUs tend to do better with a copper heat spreader. So in theory, MSI's coolers could have performed even better here. What they did do was add some heat pipes on the backplate to help spread the heat from the rear memory modules, which I haven't seen from any other vendors. They also have triple 8-pin power inputs, which thankfully in this case isn't useless like the RTX 3080, as it actually draws 370 watt stock, which is too close to a dual 8-pin power input specification. It's just unfortunate that MSI only led a 385 watt maximum power limit, which is still lower than the Founders Edition's 400 watt. They also cheaped out on the PCB design by using the worst VRM setup, like I keep on saying on this video, on an RTX 3080 by using 14 phases of 45 amp onsemi NCP302045 DRMOS that only totals 630 amps. This is really bizarre because their 3080 version has apparently a stronger VRM with 13 phases of 50 amp onsemi DRMOS that totals to 650 amps. This is so bizarre because the 3080 version has a stronger 50 amp 13 phase VRM that totals 650 amps. I had to look at multiple pictures from different reviews and zoom in really close to confirm this, and apparently yes, MSI did in fact put a weaker VRM than their 3080, unless I'm missing something here. Very confused as to why they did this, but I guess it's technically still adequate for GPU, and users shouldn't really see any issues as the max power limit won't allow it to blow up the VRM. So it's a card that has a really good cooler and a nice high stock power limit, but somehow it has the worst VRM setup out of all, which is, it makes no sense, and I don't know why they would do this, and it really almost makes me want to put it at the back of the rank for cheaping out on the VRM components. But again, VRMs, although it's nice to have a much more powerful one, it's not really necessary for the average person which just use the graphics card for gaming. The third card then, the Asus TUF Gaming, is a bit of a confusing one to rank. It has a nice and large triple fan cooler that can run cooler than the MSI, but maybe a bit too cool since the noise level it makes is higher than MSI, and so its cooling efficiency does take a hit. Asus really shouldn't have chased low temperatures like their RTX 3080 TUF Gaming with a higher powered GPU like the RTX 3090 using the same cooler. It also has a 350 watt stock power limit, which is lower than MSI's and the same as the Founders Edition. And it also has a frustrating 375 watts maximum power limit, which is lower than the MSI and Gigabyte's cards' 385 watt limit. Especially frustrating since Asus basically reused the PCB from their RTX 3080 TUF Gaming, which has a really impressive at 880 watts maximum current rating with 16 phases of 55 amp Vishay SIC641 DRMOS component setup. So what's happening here is the Asus RTX 3090 TUF Gaming has a really impressive hardware that's kinda held back by the software settings. The fourth card, the Gigabyte Eagle, performs better than the Founders Edition by running cooler and slightly quieter. And even though it has a higher maximum power limit than the Asus TUF Gaming at 385 watts, the hardware itself is not that special using a reference VRM setup, except it's 15 phases, and it uses 50 amp alpha and omega A0Z5311NQI DRMOS, so it totals to 750 amps. It also uses all SP caps on the back of the GPU, where the MLCC are generally agreed to still be preferable. But at least they're using higher quality SP caps than what Zotac uses, so they should be pretty good. And they apparently also didn't have much crashing issues even before the driver update. The Gigabyte gaming card then is pretty much just the same card with a different shroud design and a different BIOS, so you should just consider them pretty similar cards. The Founders Edition would be in 5th place for its performance alone. But if it were for looks, I'd put it in 1st place. I mean, just look at that massive heatsink. It's literally an upsized RTX 3080 Founders Edition, yet it still looks proportional and looks really professional instead of a lot of the gamery cards with a lot of RGB vomit. Their fans are also a massive 110mm in diameter, almost matching 120mm case fans in sizes, which undoubtedly helps it run pretty cool and quiet too. The VRM is also very impressive by using 16 phases of 70 amps monolithic power systems MP86957 DRMOS totaling 1120 amps maximum current capability and using also 2 groups of MLCC on the back of the GPU. So I can't help but feel like it's just a bit of a wasted opportunity with Nvidia only allowing 400 watts on the maximum power limit when it can really go a lot more, but I have to think it's limited by the dual 8-pin power input from the 12-pin and also from the cooler, which is not the best cooler for the 3090. The Zotac Trinity then is almost at last at 7th place, but at least it isn't dead last like the RTX 3080 Trinity. I rate this higher this time since it uses a better PCB design that has some more capacitors than the RTX 3080 version, but it still has a VRM setup with a 14-phase alpha and omega A0Z5311NQI 50 amp DRMOS totaling 700 amps, just like the Gigabyte. So it's nothing special, and especially with the cheaper SP caps on the back of the GPU than what Gigabyte is using, the cost-cutting measures are still quite visible on this model, which isn't great for such an expensive graphics card. At least the cooler is a lot better than the Gaming Pro, which I would rate the last card in the list purely because of the lackluster cooling performance. I mean, the Palit seems to run the hottest and loudest out of them all, so the cooling efficiency is really quite terrible. I suspect again that the shroud design that covers a lot of the fan area really isn't helping. Then the VRM is also a 14-phase Alpha and Omega A0Z5311NQI 50A DRML setup like the Zotac card and Gigabyte card. Well, at least it uses two groups of MLCC on the back of the GPU, so to me this card doesn't really seem like an extreme cost optimized design, just a bad design decision by using the same cooler as their RTX 3080 Gaming Pro, which was also running pretty hot on that card. The only benefit that I can see with this card is it's a quite narrow design that doesn't reach above the PCI bracket height, so it might have some niche uses in some SFF cases. Well, that's it for this video. I hope you all found the information useful to decide which RTX 3090 to buy. Well, if you can buy one, that is. I would still suggest you do your own research and reach your own conclusion by reading the reviews yourself though, which I've linked down below. Also comment if you have one of these cards and let us know what your experience is like. If you like this video, please leave a like and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. And thanks for watching.